and especially the rich and the elite. And they gave the bran, what they called animal feed, to the peasants and the poor people. Only recently did we figure out, wait a minute, the poor people are healthier. We did something wrong. Give us the bran back, you know. And
in other words, it paid to be broke.
yeah,
Hey, I got it. I'm on the same page.
It happens over and over again.
Pay attention. Here it is.
The longshoremen used to have to walk with 100-pound bags up planks into the ships, down into the hold of the ship, and back all day long. And when the actuaries for insurance companies started analyzing who would live the longest, because they have to start doing things like life insurance, I figured out these guys were living longer than anyone. And it's like, you know, and it's because, so you give them poor food, you give them a poor job, and they live forever, you know. And so, but
some good news.
right. So, you know, it pays to be frugal and work hard, you know. But what is interesting is that the mills spent hundreds of years getting the flour whiter and whiter and more pure and more pure. And all of a sudden you come to them and say, wait a minute, can you put that bran back in? I know that you just spent $1 million getting the last 0.1% flour out, and we want it back in. Oh my goodness, all this work, it's like you're undoing all that work. And so it's just somewhat of frustration from the millers that spend all this time making white flour to have everyone going back to whole wheat. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about flour and how to make bread, all right? And so the first thing we start with is the flour. And the flour is going to be the structure for your bread, all right? It's what stands up, holds all the other ingredients. It's responsible for the gas retention, what holds the gas. An interesting trivia question, if you're at American Institute of Baking, is dough will hold gas, is impermeable to gas, it'll expand. Bread is not. Bread just releases gas. It's no longer holding it, because once it's baked, all the bubbles will burst, it will hold it. But the more protein you have, the more crust color you're going to have. If it's bleached or not bleached, the texture, if you have a good spring wheat, you're going to have a nice soft texture and taste. And some people claim there are differences in taste, and I can tell you that there are. If you taste einkorn, the ancient grain, and emmer, which is also an ancient grain grown here in North Dakota, you can see the visual difference and you can taste it. Spelt also. They don't bake very well at all, but they have really good taste. Now, water is the second one that's important if you're baking bread. And the general rule is hard water is going to make hard bread, soft water is going to make soft. But the water, nothing happens without the water. Just like the wheat seed remains dormant until you get it wet. Bread's the same way. You can throw all the dry ingredients together. They're not going to do anything until water comes along. So water does everything. And there's a lot of competition for that water. Bread in itself is starved of water. The yeast that's growing in there is literally dying of thirst. The water, when you look at the salt and the water content, the salt dissolves in the water. It's about the same salinity as ocean water. It's pretty salty in there for the yeast. Another thing that is like a trivia question is, people are anti-gluten. And so one of the questions is, you see a bag of high gluten flour. And you might ask the question, how much gluten is in that flour? And the answer is 0. Well, how do you mean 0? Because gluten doesn't exist until you take the two proteins that are in wheat and add water to them and mix them, and then they form gluten. Gluten is only formed when it gets wet and is subject to mechanical action. Now, if you just eat flour, you're chewing and your saliva will form gluten in your mouth. But a trivia question is, in that bag of dry flour, 0 gluten. So the water dissolves the sugar, gets it to the yeast. They say the yeast was dying of dehydration until they got the water. And so it starts activating. Reactions with starches to set up. That's what's going to set your loaf. the type of water you have is real important. For home baking, it's usually not that big a concern. We have really good water here in the United States. We're really lucky, and it's not that way elsewhere. So this water quality might be a big deal for people in Mexico or Haiti. Not so much here. You need to pay attention to the hardness. If you have extremely hard water, you're going to have to treat it in some way. And if it's heavily chlorinated, it might affect it.
But water has to be sold for milk
Yes,
instead of water.
sure. And so your water that's in your milk is about perfectly conditioned. It's been conditioned by the cow. And so the cow, if it had extra hardness, the cow took that calcium and you put it in its bones and it puts back, so it's, yeah. So you wouldn't have to worry about milk at all. So salt is considered one of the essential, there's really only 4 essential ingredients to make bread. Flour, water, salt, and yeast. That's it. So you need that. Typical levels are about 1.5 to 2.5%. Like I said, the yeast is having a hard time with that salty water. As you go up in salt, the yeast slows down. It doesn't kill it, but it slows it way down. And because there's competition, because just like salt dehydrates you, it dehydrates the gluten and makes it a little tougher. Sometimes because of that, and I said there's competition, you want that yeast to get a good drink of water. So sometimes you'll delay the salt, you'll mix the dough for most of the mixing time. And it's slack, but you're letting everything do its thing. The enzymes are doing their work on the starches and the proteins, and they're coming together. And you allow it to happen, and then at the last minute you throw the salt in and it dries it up real quick and mix it that way. But give everything else a shot at it first. Sugars. We have a lot of different forms of sugar. It's food for yeast. The yeast uses that in the fermentation and takes sugar and turns it into carbon dioxide, which expands the loaf. But it also produces acids and flavors. And so as the pH goes down, makes the proteins do what you want them to do. Yeast, if you look at it, is just a whole other study in itself. It is one of the most powerful little critters you can imagine. So going back to sugar, and we'll go on yeast here in a second. So the leftover sugar, we always, here in America, we love sweet bread. If the Europeans come over here and they taste our bread, they say it tastes like cake. In fact, Subway sandwiches, which you don't think of that high sugar content if you ever go to the Subway shop, can't be classified as bread in parts of Europe because it has so much sugar. They have to classify it as cake. So our level of sugar in our bread is really high. Most other bakers only put enough to get the yeast happy and no more. But we like a lot of leftover sugar. Sugar, as you know, will caramelize, and those that bake, it has a big browning effect, so the more sugar you have in the bread, the more brown it's going to get quicker. But this is the important fact that I think is interesting, in my opinion. There's been a big anti-high fructose corn sweetener. High fructose corn sweetener. Don't ever eat that. That's the worst stuff in the world, you know. And so McDonald's, for instance, has quit using it. And so if you go get a McDonald's hamburger bun and you ask for the nutritional sheet, they'll give it to you and it'll say sucrose. It won't say high fructose corn sweetener. Sucrose is table sugar. It's just sugar. But it's liquefied, but it's sugar. And now I feel so much better now.